got Lisa Bortolotti here to talk about delusions, another topic dear to many of our hearts. And Lisa is a professor of philosophy at the University of Birmingham, also affiliated with the Institute for Mental Health. So we definitely have lots of medical interest often in the audience, don't we, Robin, from many of our guests. So this should be an interesting subject for us. Lisa's also the author of Why Delusions Matter, a recent book out last year, I think, and Delusions and Other Irrational Beliefs, as well as textbooks in the philosophy of science and philosophy of psychology. Currently working on epistemic injustice in healthcare. And Lisa's going to talk to us a little bit about delusions, how they are characterized in philosophy, and how the word delusion is used within and beyond the clinical context, and how and why conspiracy theories and denialism are described as delusional. And Lisa's going to talk through when and how we attribute delusional beliefs and some of the issues and questions that arise from that. So Lisa, thank you very much for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thanks to Paul and Nick for the invitation. I'm really delighted to be here. It's a beautiful place. I didn't know Barnes at all. And I'm really happy that I had the opportunity to come here, and I have the opportunity now to talk to you. So this is a talk that spans across things that I've worked on in the past and things that are described and discussed in the book that Nick mentioned, so Why Delusions Matter. But it's also a talk that looks at the future and kind of avenues for research that are very much related to the project that Nick mentioned, which is Project EPIC, Epistemic Injustice in Healthcare. So the word delusion is a very special word, which has, of course, the technical meaning because it is used in psychiatry to denote a symptom of a number of psychiatric disorders. It's mostly associated with schizophrenia, but actually delusions appear in a number of other conditions, including amnesia, dementia, delusional disorder, even bipolar, and even depression. There are depressive delusions as well. So in that context, delusion has a very specific application. The word delusion has a very specific application. Although, of course, psychiatrists and psychologists do disagree on the perfect definition of delusion. When philosophers come in, they look at the word delusion and at these definitions with a critical eye, also because they are very much aware, as we are all, I think, that the word delusion is not just a technical term. It's a word that we use. We tend to say you're delusional when we disapprove of what someone is saying. And we know that in the popular press, we've got plenty of examples in the last few years. The word delusion or delusional has also been associated with beliefs that are not at all an indication of a pathology. For instance, certain forms of denialism or certain forms of conspiracy theories. Also, we are probably aware of a book called The God Delusion. So, I mean, people do use the word delusion outside the clinic. And an interesting question, at least for me, I don't know, I'm hoping I can make it interesting for you as well, is whether there is a significant and interesting overlap between the delusion that we talk about in the clinical context and the word delusion as we use it in everyday life in these other contexts that are not necessarily medical contexts. I want to start with the DSM definition of delusion. So DSM stands for Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And in the US is the main diagnostic manuals. We've got something else in Europe, but actually the DSM is used very widely in research worldwide. So when people do research, they refer to the diagnostic criteria that are present in this particular manual. So in a kind of joking way, irreverent way, researchers talk about the DSM as the Bible of psychiatry, right? So when people are interested in the meaning of words that have to do with psychiatry, they normally go to the DSM. But I said irreverent because very often they go to the DSM to criticize the definition that they find there. The DSM is not very popular. So I want to start with the DSM definition of delusion, but not because I endorse it or because I think, it's the last word on what delusions are, but just to give a little bit of context and to have a starting point from where we can actually think about whether there is a better way of thinking about delusion. So the DSM definition of delusion, as you've got in your handout, is a false belief based on incorrect inference about external reality that is firmly sustained despite what almost everybody else believes and despite what constitutes incontrovertible and obvious proof or evidence to the contrary. There is a clause that is attached to that. These beliefs are not ordinarily accepted by other members of the person's culture or subculture. So we could stay all week discussing this definition, but I just want to point out some things that you might have already noticed in reading this definition. It's interesting that it is in a diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders, but it doesn't tell us very much about how delusions come about. It doesn't give us a causal history, when do we get delusions? Rather, it describes delusion in the way in which people behave when they report delusions, right? So it's about what we call the surface features, the behavioral manifestations of the phenomenon. It's not about, what causes the phenomenon. And this is something that people notice about the DSM in general, that it's based on symptoms, right? And symptoms are things that we observe in the way we behave. Some symptoms we cannot just observe with our naked eye. We need some medical tests in order to understand them better. But normally the symptom is the thing that alerts us that something is wrong. And so it's something that is quite possible to perceive in people's behavior. The other thing that as a philosopher really interests me is that it's not just any behavior that is captured in this definition, but almost all the words that are used in this definition are epistemic concepts. What do I mean by epistemic? Something is epistemic when it has to do with belief and knowledge, right? So words like evidence are epistemic. Knowledge itself is epistemic. And it's interesting that almost all the words in this definition are epistemic. So we talk about a belief that is false, that is based on incorrect inference, and two epistemic words, and is firmly sustained despite counter-evidence and counter-argument. So it's very interesting that, again, we're talking about something that should be a medical phenomenon, but we're doing it in words that have to do with the way in which we learn about reality, whether what we learn about reality is correct, whether we've got evidence for it, whether we are prepared to give it up if we receive counter-evidence for it. So I think this is really interesting and also makes us think about the way in which definitions work. We normally think as philosophers, but in other fields of life as well, the definitions are the kind of things that give us necessary and sufficient conditions for something to obtain, right? So the definition needs to be telling us what counts as a delusion, but also what other things that may look a little bit like delusions actually are not delusions, and why they are not delusions, right? So they should give us a demarcation criterion to decide what is a delusion and what is not. But if you think about it, this kind of definition is pretty broad. If you think about cases of self-deception, for instance, if you think about cases of confabulation, when we tell ourselves stories about the past because we don't actually remember how things went, they could fit pretty well with the current definition of delusion in the DSM. So as a definition, it's problematic for a number of ways that I will discuss with you. But also there is this problem that it doesn't demarcate what delusions are very clearly. Now, as it happens, I don't think that's a problem. I think that that is something that in general we need to face, that a lot of definitions that also have a diagnostic function are not the kind of definitions that give us necessary and sufficient conditions. I mean, that's the kind of desideratum, that's what we would like to have. That's the ideal definition. But a lot of phenomena in real life, they're complex, they're difficult, they're messy. We don't get necessarily sufficient conditions. The most that we can get is a better idea about how to identify delusions, right? So it's not really a problem that it doesn't demarcate the concept very clearly, but it is also significant that it doesn't distinguish very well the phenomenon of delusions as a clinical phenomenon from other phenomena that we live with every day, on an everyday basis, such as some forms of conspiracy theories or denialism, some forms of self-deception, some forms of prejudice maybe, and so on. So I think that's an interesting point to raise, which we will come back to. One more observation about the clause. As you can guess, that clause was added to avoid having to come to the conclusion that, I don't know, religious beliefs are delusions, right? Because it may be that religious beliefs or ideological political beliefs are the kind of thing that, you know, for our opponents are not true, and that I don't really take evidence to be really important to how I believe them or how strongly I believe them. However, they are widespread either in my community or in a subculture. So if you think about a religious belief that belongs to the mainstream in a certain society, that would be, you know, shared by lots and lots of people in that culture. But if you think about a non-mainstream belief, like a conspiracy belief, it might not be shared by everybody, but there is a well-defined community that shares that belief. It's never just one person, right? That's the idea. So the indication here is that for delusion to be a clinical phenomenon, it needs to be idiosyncratic to the person. It needs to be the kind of belief that the person has and defends quite strenuously, firmly sustained, as the definition says, but it's not something that is shared by anybody else, right? So that potentially is the only aspect of the definition that gives us some kind of demarcation. Now, we may think it's still not a very good way of making the demarcation, because we know that, you know, in psychiatry, we've got this phenomenon of collective delusions, where occasionally a clinical delusion is shared by other people, but that is pretty rare. So, you know, the point of the clause was to try to narrow it down. Okay, so let's go through the different aspects of the definition. Most people I talk to are worried about the DSM definition, but they're not really concerned about thinking of delusions as false. Because, and I think they're right about that, when we call something a delusion, we almost imply that it's false. You'd be very difficult, you know, in a conversation to hear something like this, oh, you know, he's delusional, but what he's saying is true. You know, you don't really make sense. So most of the time, it is true that when we talk about something and we describe it as delusional, we also think that it is false. But as many have observed, not just philosophers, but also psychiatrists, it's now actually the case that all delusions are false. And here maybe is the right time to give you some examples of delusions. So I mentioned that delusions are very typical positive symptom of schizophrenia. And in schizophrenia, you may have a number of different delusions. For instance, you may have the delusion of reference, when you think that everything that happens to you, everything you are experiencing is trying to tell you something, or is sending you a message of some sort. You may have a delusion of persecution, where you think that maybe your colleagues are trying to get you fired when other people don't think that's the case. You may have a delusion of jealousy, when you think your romantic partner is being unfaithful to you, when again, you know, other people don't think there is enough evidence of that. And those are quite common delusions. But then there are some rare delusions, which are a little bit different from this, which seem to be very counterintuitive. The ones that philosophers prefer are the Capgras delusion and the Cotter delusion. And they've got these French names because it's the French psychiatrist who first observed the phenomena. But the Capgras phenomenon is when I think that someone very close to me, maybe a family member or maybe my spouse, has been replaced by an imposter who is almost identical to the person that I love. So I would say things like, I know he looks very much like my husband, but you know, I know my husband really well. This is not my husband, it's someone else. Now, across different cultural periods, you've got different theories about what might have happened, what the substitution was like. Some people in the 70s were talking about aliens. Later on, people talked about cloning. So there is always an explanation that might follow from that. But in general, the idea is that's not my husband. That's not how my husband looks like. That's not how my husband behaves. So that's the capital delusion. The quarter delusion is even more difficult to believe because the quarter delusion is the belief that I'm dead. Now, some philosophers think that is a self-defeating belief because if I believe that I'm dead, how can I think that, I'm dead? Who is doing this thinking that I'm dead if I'm dead? So in the kind of original version, the quarter delusion is extremely difficult to get our heads around. There is also another version of quarter delusion where I don't actually think that I'm dead, but I think that I'm disembodied. And also people may say, I can see my body from outside and things like that. Now, these kind of beliefs sound very bizarre. And actually, bizarre is a technical term in this case. They are considered really difficult to believe because they are outside our normal experience. Sometimes they are physically impossible. That is, for instance, one example by a psychiatrist I work a lot with, Matthew Broom, and one of his patients was saying she gave birth to an infinite number of messiahs. Now, no woman can give birth to an infinite number of people, right? So, sometimes the content of the delusion is physically impossible, and sometimes it's logically impossible too. So you've got this case where some delusions are really bizarre, but on the other side, some of the more mundane delusions like jealousy and persecution are not bizarre at all because they actually encapsulate our greatest fears, right? The fear that the people that we trust are betraying us or they want to harm us. And they're very natural kind of beliefs to have, although, when they got to the point that people identify it as a delusion, they may sound, again, difficult to believe. But it has been observed, and there are some interesting case studies in the literature, that sometimes delusions of persecution happen to be true. So, or delusions of jealousy happen to be true. So, for instance, in the case of persecution, what has been noticed with epidemiological studies that were not available before is that a risk factor for developing delusions of persecution is having had a very difficult childhood characterized, for instance, by abuse or by violence or by bullying. So bullying is one of the greatest risk factors for developing paranoia later in life. Now, if when you were a young person, you were betrayed and mistreated by the people who were supposed to care for you, the people you trusted, it's not so surprising that later in life you develop a certain amount of suspicion towards people around you, right? So it becomes easier to understand why people may develop these kind of beliefs. But occasionally, the actual belief, my colleagues are trying to get me fired, may be actually true. Maybe that's what they want to do. Or in the case of jealousy, when people doubt the fidelity of their partners, it may actually be true that their partners are being unfaithful. So some people are saying it's not whether the content of the delusion is true or false that determines whether that is a delusion. It's something else. It's how the person believes it. It's the relationship between the content of the belief and the evidence for it. And when the two things don't seem to match, when it seems as if the person is endorsing something but doesn't have the evidence that supports that content, that is what triggers this attribution of delusion. Not so much whether the delusion is true or false, because maybe by chance or by luck, the delusion could actually be true, right? We cannot exclude that. The way I like to think about beliefs is that they're not things that kind of float around us and that we can kind of grab and discuss in this kind of very physical sense. I think delusions and beliefs are the kind of notions that make sense when we think about how we relate to other people. And I think that, when we attribute a belief to someone else, and that we do that all the time, we do it because we want to understand that person a little bit better. Maybe we want to be able to predict what they will do next, so we can coordinate with them, right? So I always think about the notion of belief as something that involves a speaker who says something, an interpreter who is listening to what the speaker is saying, and the shared environment. So what the interpreter is doing is trying to understand what goes on in the mind of the speaker, because the mind is not transparent. We don't know what goes on in other people's minds, based on what the speaker is doing and how they are behaving. So not just the words that they say, but their body language, their expression, and so on, and the relationship between the speaker and the environment. So if we think about it in that way, rather than talking about delusions as beliefs that are out there, we can think about the phenomenon where the interpreter attributes a delusion to a speaker. And we can ask the question, when does that happen? When does it happen that the interpreter decides that what the speaker is saying is a delusion? And that's the kind of way that I want to look at it, right? It seems to me, and this is something that the philosopher Sam Wilkinson has argued in 2020, for instance, in a very nice paper on delusion attribution, that when we are ascribing a delusion to someone, when we're describing someone's belief as a delusion, what we are actually doing is expressing some kind of disapproval towards that belief. What I mean is that the word delusion is not neutral, right? It's not that you can say this is a delusion and it's a good thing, right? Because the word delusion is already containing a negative judgment of some sort. And according to Wilkinson, this is like a reaction of epistemic disapproval. Okay, I understand you have that belief, but you shouldn't have that belief. So that's what I'm doing when I'm talking about something as being a delusion. Now, the next thing that Wilkinson says, though, I want to keep a little bit of distance from, because he says there's nothing more that we can say about delusion. It's just an expression of epistemic disapproval. So disapproval towards the belief of another. And I'm thinking, well, it'd be nice to be able to say a little bit more, because there are a lot of things that we disapprove of, but not everything we are happy to call a delusion. So what is it about that particular belief that we disapprove of, and that gives rise to this attribution of a delusion? And I think that helps us understand a little bit more those aspects of the DSM definition that we were not initially completely happy with. Think about the content of the delusion, because we have already started talking about it. Is it false? Yes, sometimes, most of the time, typically it is false. It's not always false, though. And it's not its being false that is triggering this epistemic disapproval. We have a lot of false beliefs that don't actually attract this kind of strong disapproval, right? It seems to be something else that is going on. And the way I characterize it is that it's the kind of belief that the interpreter finds very difficult to endorse. It may be very easy for the speaker to think that, you know, they are dead or their husband is being unfaithful. But when they report that belief, for the interpreter, given how the interpreter is observing both the speaker and the surrounding environment, it's very difficult to believe. Now, there is a word that I like and that I want to use in this context, which is implausibility. I think what happens here is that delusion is something that the interpreter always finds implausible. Whether it is true or false, it is implausible. Now, why do I like that word? It has an interesting history. So it comes from the Latin plaudere, which is approve of something, you know, a clap when something is good. So what we're saying when we're saying that something is implausible is that we do not approve of it. And in particular, when we're thinking about a belief, it's not just about the content of the belief, but it is the relationship between the content of the belief and the other things that we believe. They don't match, right? Given all the things that I already believe, my background knowledge, this particular belief doesn't fit. That's what the interpreter is saying. So in the case of, you know, I've given birth to an infinite number of Messiah, it can't happen. You know, I know about, you know, women giving birth. They can't do that. It doesn't fit with the other things that I know. When we're thinking about I'm dead, you can't be dead if you're saying that you're dead, right? That doesn't fit with my idea of what it is to be dead. So what the interpreter is saying, and that's one thing that he's saying when he makes an attribution of delusionality, when he says that something is a delusion, is that this is a belief that the speaker seems to be very fond of, very attached to, but it's a belief that appears to the interpreter as implausible. Okay, so let's move on to the second point in the DSM definition, which is this idea that the delusion is based on incorrect inference and is firmly sustained despite what almost everybody else believes and despite counter-evidence and so on. So there is a sense in which very often delusions are described as fixed. That means that you adopt them, doesn't matter, on the basis of what evidence, but once you have adopted them, it's very, very difficult for you to give them up. If I had to choose one characteristic of delusion that everybody agrees on, it's going to be that one. It's this aspect of fixity. This fact that, as philosophers put it sometimes, the belief doesn't seem to be sensitive to evidence. You get some evidence that suggests that the belief is false, but you keep your confidence or conviction in the belief. Your conviction doesn't falter. And that's why some philosophers think that we shouldn't think of delusions as beliefs at all, because they say, but no, look, beliefs have to do with evidence. Beliefs change when evidence changes, right? If delusions do not change when evidence changes, then they're not beliefs at all. I think that's going too far. I think that delusions are beliefs. I think a lot of our beliefs are fixed in many ways, not just delusions. But there is this element where we are thinking that actually the delusion is not the kind of belief that you happily give up after a pleasant conversation at the pub with your friends who disagree with you and show you evidence against the delusion. Now, we may wonder why that happens. Why is it that the delusion seems to be so resistant to counter-evidence? It is true that delusions sometimes do happen to change. We know, for instance, that the conviction in a delusional belief changes across time in a clinical context. So, for instance, in the acute stage of psychosis, people are firmly convinced that the belief is true. But, after medication or other moments of their lives, they might think that, I'm not so sure. And they talk a little bit differently about the content of the delusion. They talk as if, I feel as if I was dead, or it feels as if my husband is an imposter, and so on. So it's not true that the conviction is always that strong, but it's true that it can be really strong, and that people can believe in delusions for years and years and base all their lives on these delusions. So there is an element there that seems to be right. And I think that, one way of thinking about it is that for the interpreter, from the point of view of the interpreter, this is an implausible belief that is unshakable for the speaker. The speaker doesn't seem to be the kind of person who is going to be moved by evidence to the contrary. But why is that the case? Why is it that the speaker doesn't seem to be moved? There are different ways in which we can go here. I mean, one observation is that in the clinical context, the delusion very often is driven by a very unusual experience. Why is it that I think my husband, the person who everybody considers my husband, is an imposter? People with Capgras delusion have a very particular experience. They have their facial recognition system intact when it comes to recognizing whether a face is similar to another face. But what is broken is the affective component of the recognition. So they see the face, they identify it as the face of my husband, but they don't feel the usual warmth that they feel when they look at their husband, because that channel of recognition, the affective one, is broken. If you think about it, it's a very unusual experience to have. It must be very unsettling for people to see the face of someone they love without feeling anything about it, as if it was a stranger. So if you think about it, it is the strangeness of the experience that explains to some extent the strangeness of the belief. But also, it makes it almost impossible for people to change their mind because they keep having this experience, and the experience needs to be explained. In the case of the Cotter delusion, someone who managed to get rid of the delusion described it in a podcast with Daniel Freeman, who is a psychiatrist in Oxford, as an extreme feeling of jet lag. It's as if you wake up and all of a sudden, all of your experience feels detached and bland. It's not just one thing that, feels detached, like the glass of water, everything, right? So it's not so unusual to think that, oh, there's something wrong with me, maybe I'm dead, because you have lost the connection to everything. And usually people who develop co-third are actually depressed. So again, you know, they tend to attribute everything that doesn't work in their lives to themselves. So it's not so incredible to think that they might come up with this belief, but also it's not incredible that they might keep this belief as long as they have this strange experience. So the experience might begin to explain why people don't want to give up the belief, because the only other explanation for something so unusual would be, I'm seriously mentally ill. It's not an explanation that most of us will readily accept. It's a very difficult explanation to accept. It's very psychologically costly, right? So usually people are moved by the delusion, by their experiences. The other reason why I think that the unshakability of the delusion can be understood is that delusion may start as a small thing that happens to you and that you want to explain. But it doesn't stay a small thing. It becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. It absorbs all of your mental energy. And it's interesting, different authors describe it in different ways, but it's as if towards the end, it's almost as if everything in your life and in your experience is explained through that delusion. The delusion becomes, some people say, like Phil Corlett, for instance, the default explanation for anything that doesn't fit. Anything that you don't have an explanation for, the delusion can stretch to explain that. What I'm trying to say, and this is not something that people have said before, that the delusion becomes central to the speaker's identity. And that's why the speaker doesn't want to give it up. Because the delusion becomes part of the personal and social identity of the speaker. So the social identity is something that we all have, right? In my case, I have a lot of social identities. I'm sure it's the same for you. I'm an academic, I'm a mother, I'm a woman, I'm an Italian. You know, all of these social identities are there, are part of who I am, of how I see myself, of how people see me, and so on. But I also have a personal identity. So there are things that I care about that in my eyes define who I am, and it's the way that I present myself to other people. So for instance, I'm a feminist, or I don't know, I love philosophy. Those are not just things about me. They are things without whom I wouldn't be the same person. What I'm trying to say is that delusion may not start as an identity belief, but it becomes an identity belief for the speaker. It becomes the kind of thing that makes sense to them. It becomes the kind of thing that shapes the way they see themselves and they see the relationship between themselves and others. So going back to the interpreter-speaker triangle, where the third side is the world, what happens when the interpreter ascribes a delusion to a speaker? It happens that the interpreter recognizes that the speaker has an unshakable identity belief that they, the interpreter, find implausible. And I think that captures, I mean, it doesn't say everything we want to say about delusions, but it captures that epistemic disapproval that Wilkinson was noticing and was describing in terms of, this expression of disapproval. So that delusion attribution is expressing disapproval. And he was saying, we can't say very much more about it. Well, we can say a little bit more about it. Maybe this is the source of the disapproval. The source of the disapproval is that there is a belief that the speaker doesn't want to give up, that considers almost self-defining, but that belief is unshakable, so it's not sensitive to evidence in many ways. And it is the kind of belief that this interpreter finds implausible. Why do I say it's not sensitive to evidence in many ways? So why is that qualification? Because as I suggested to you, there is evidence for the delusional belief. In the clinical context, the evidence is this weird, unusual experience that is usually due to a neurophysiological deficit that the person is experiencing. So this experience provides reinforcement for the delusion. There is something that doesn't work. My husband doesn't feel like my husband. Things around me don't feel like they are as usual things around me. Or everybody's looking at me weird, they're having glances, they're sharing rumors about me, they want to harm me, right? So the delusion appears as an explanation of things that we don't understand, things that often we find threatening, and things that worry us, that concern us. So that's the first point. in trying to understand what the notion of delusion may capture. Now, if we want to be fair, I was saying that the DSM definition of delusion is not very good at demarcating what delusions are, because it can apply to other things like prejudice or self-deception or confabulation. Well, what I've described to you also doesn't work as a very good demarcation, because yes, it captures the experience of clinical delusions by and large, with some exceptions, of course, because we're not in the business of trying to find necessary and sufficient conditions, but it captures also other types of experiences. So I was saying at the beginning that sometimes we hear the word delusion or the adjective delusional attributed to other beliefs that are not considered pathological, such as climate change denialism, for instance, or COVID denialism, or QAnon beliefs, and so on. This happens in the national press, this happens in conversations with people, but also, researchers have started investigating exactly this question. In psychology, in psychiatry, in sociology, in philosophy, people have been asking, how are conspiracy theories different from delusion? Right? Because sometimes they sound really implausible, they are insensitive to evidence, at least, from the perspective of the interpreter. So where is the difference? Couldn't we, just consider them very close, if not completely overlapping? So there is a sense in which the kind of process that I've described to you, where the interpreter ascribes a delusion to a speaker following those three criteria, implausibility, unshakability, and centrality to identity, could certainly apply to things like beliefs in conspiracy theories, where, of course, the speaker endorses a conspiracy theory that the interpreter does not endorse, right? So in those cases, we also think that, something like a conspiracy theory may become central to the person's identity, even if the conspiracy theory is about something very external to the speaker, like, climate change denialism. It may actually fit with other things that the speaker believes. For instance, if the speaker has some kind of anti-science sentiments, or if the speaker has a natural tendency to be very suspicious of what the government or the authorities say, they might go hand in hand with their conspiracy belief. And indeed, we know that certain types of conspiracy theories are much more widespread in parts of the population that have been traditionally and historically marginalized, because they know that the government or the authorities or the scientific community haven't always acted in their best interest. And so they infer that even this time, it may not be a good thing for them to trust the mainstream explanation of something that is affecting them. So there is a sense in which this process of delusion attribution can happen and can kind of make sense, even in this context where there doesn't seem to be a belief that is tied to a pathology. Which leads us to a consideration. Most people think that there are some structural similarities between, let's say, conspiracy beliefs and delusional beliefs in the clinical context. Although, of course, the kind of the causal mechanisms that produce those beliefs may be very different. But again, the DSM definition doesn't talk about causal mechanisms. So the surface features may be very similar. But where people think that the two are very different is in something that I haven't talked about at all so far, which is the consequences of having that particular belief. So people tend to think that having a clinical delusion is bad for you. And that's a very safe assumption to make, because the great majority of clinical delusions are actually harmful to the speaker, to the person who has the delusion. They often create a very big gap between the world of the speaker and the world of everybody else, making socialization very difficult. And indeed, we know that delusions, having a delusion may mean that people are isolated, they are sanctioned when they speak about their delusion, and eventually they kind of withdraw from social contact and become, again, very alone, very lacking of support. So we know that there is harm in that. We also know that there is sometimes harm in the very content of some delusions. If you live in a world where you think that everybody is out to get you, you will not be a very happy person. You will always be on the lookout for trouble. Delusions of guilt are particularly harmful. People tend to think that everything that that is bad, that is happening to them, is their fault. And they may, as a result, self-harm because of this. So they are actually types of delusions that cause the speaker to have a very unhappy life and not function properly. But one thing to consider is that there is harm that comes directly from the content of the delusion. And I don't deny that that's the case for many delusions. But there is also harm that comes from the way in which society reacts to people reporting a delusion. And that is harm that we can do something about, because it's not harm that stems directly from having the delusion. It's harm that comes from the fact that people sometimes make assumptions about people who report strange beliefs and are not really happy to listen or happy to consider that actually there may be a story behind the delusion. There may be a story that makes sense of what the person is saying. Now, it's not always easy to get to the story because it's not something that is obvious and transparent to the interpreter. But a well-trained interpreter will know how to ask questions, will know how to listen. Instead of sanctioning, saying, oh, you're delusional, I'm not listening to you, you're not a worthy partner in this conversation. They might ask questions such as, how do you believe that? How did you come to believe that? What was your experience like? And only when people engage in that type of conversation and express genuine curiosity about the delusion itself and the origin of the delusion, that the people with the delusion open up and talk. And then you discover the connections between events in their lives, adverse events very often, and the delusion. And the delusion becomes much less crazy, much more understandable. So there is a way of actually working against the stigma that is associated with reporting delusions. And that causes a lot of the harm that is also attributed to delusions. People think that conspiracy beliefs, for instance, don't have this harmful side to them. They think that conspiracy beliefs sometimes make people feel better. Maybe because they give them a reason to feel a strong affiliation with a small group that they identify with. And also because sometimes conspiracy beliefs are motivating. You know, they get you to protest about things, or they get you, you know, to kind of defend your beliefs. And the idea is that the conspiracy belief responds to some needs that people have to to attain some kind of certainty about what is going on in life that does not depend on waiting for the scientists to get all the evidence that they need. And also gives meaning to the way that people kind of deal with other people and with things that happen in the world. And we see this especially in moments of crisis, which is when conspiracy beliefs explode and expand so much. It's because there is a crisis, there is an uncertainty that is very difficult for us to tolerate. We need an explanation. We don't trust those who give us an explanation. We come up with our own explanation. So people think, at least at the beginning, they were thinking that actually the conspiracy belief has a positive effect rather than a negative effect on the speaker. But recent investigations in psychology have actually found that although the conspiracy belief emerges because there are these needs for certainty, needs for uniqueness, need for understanding what is going on, these conspiracy beliefs are not actually very good at satisfying those needs. So very often the person with conspiracy beliefs experiences some of the phenomena that we have described for the person who has delusions. They may feel excluded in certain contexts, not listened to, not considered a worthy partner in a conversation, at least on the topic of the conspiracy belief. And also they may feel sometimes that the conspiracy belief doesn't give them the resources that they need to deal with the problems that they have. So certainly there are these analogies there, but it's not a very clear picture where clinical delusions are harmful and other types of delusional beliefs that are not clinical are not harmful. It's more complicated than that. The other aspect of it, which almost nobody talks about, is that clinical delusions can actually have benefits for the speaker. And if we didn't think about that, you'd seem almost impossible that the speaker is so attached to the delusional belief, because we would say, yes, okay, it's part of their identity, it explains their experiences, but if it is so harmful for them, why don't they give it up eventually, right? And the reason why they don't give it up is that very often the clinical delusion, as well as other forms of delusional beliefs that are more widespread, give speakers some way of making sense of their experience that is meaningful to them. I worked a few years ago with a PhD student who interviewed people with acute delusions. And basically what she did is just tell me about the belief that got you into trouble. And for 1 hour, she just let this person speak. And very often in these transcripts, it was incredible because these people were saying, oh, I've never said this to my psychiatrist, but. And they were just talking about the first time that they had this particular belief and what had happened just before then. And what my PhD student found, Rachel Gunn, who has now successfully finished her PhD, is that very often there was an emotional affective crisis that immediately preceded the beginning of the delusional experience and the delusional belief. And usually what had happened to this person in real life was actually very strictly connected with the content of the delusion that they were having. So I'll just give you an example. There was a woman who thought there were little cameras inside the flowers of her garden, and the police had put them there to monitor what she was doing, right? These may sound very implausible, right? Why would the police want to monitor you by using little cameras and put them into the flowers of your garden? But then when you talk to them long enough, so this woman was describing how one of her relatives had been accused of sexual assault. And since then, all her neighbors had stopped talking to her. And she always felt they were watching her and judging her. So of course, you know, a real life experience does not explain or does not justify the delusional belief that there are little cameras in the flowers. But it makes it much easier for us to understand why someone might get to that belief, because they've had an experience where they felt constantly observed and constantly judged, and that experience changed the way they were living. Very often, we find that certain types of belief, like erotomania or grandiose delusions. Erotomania is when you think that a celebrity is in love with you, or a grandiose delusion is when you think that you are a genius, even if people do not recognize that. They very often follow from adverse experiences where the person has been underestimated, neglected, abandoned, and feels that they are worthless. So the delusion becomes a reaction to that feeling. I'm not worthless. God is talking to me. I'm not worthless. I don't know who is a famous person. George Clooney is in love with me, right? So that's the mechanism. So in a sense, delusions are protective. They're not there just to confuse the speaker. They're there to establish, to restore a certain emotional balance that the speaker has lost. They do it in an imperfect and ultimately harmful way. I'm not saying that they are the right solution to the problem, but they are a reaction, a response to a problem. They're not the origin of the problem. And there is a very interesting study by a group of psychiatrists in Ferrara in Italy, where they found that when people start losing faith in their delusions, you'd expect them to recover beautifully. You expect them finally to feel better. But what happens is that very often they fall into a very severe depression and they end up having thoughts of suicide. They call this the insight paradox. The more the person acquires insight into their delusion, the less they're happy with their lives. Why? Well, because yes, they recognize that their belief was not the answer, but their belief has been their lives for a long time. Remember, it's part of their identity, and now it's taken away from them, but they've got nothing to replace it with. They haven't got another solution to the problems that they have, to the fact that they feel worthless, to the fact that they've been abandoned, and so on. So what these psychiatrists are suggesting, Belvedere, Murray and colleagues, is that when we are getting to that point of the trajectory in the person's mental health journey, what we need to provide is some sort of psychological therapy that helps them find a way of finding meaning in their lives. The meaning that the delusion was giving to them, but now the delusion is gone and they need to find meaning in something else. So they, for instance, they suggest that certain forms of narrative therapy are very effective in providing this additional help and support to people. But that's interesting because the insight paradox does suggest that the delusion is there because it's doing something, right? It's actually providing some kind of, is giving the person a framework where they can see their lives as meaningful. I'm just going to conclude with the last point, why I think talking about delusions is important. And I've already hinted at this, but I think it's worth repeating. If we think that beliefs and delusions in particular are about the way in which we relate to each other, so for instance, what you might call a delusion may be a very important belief of mine, but we've got this system of triangulation where in order to coordinate with each other and understand each other, we have to ascribe meanings to what the other person is saying, and sometimes we agree with what the other person is saying, sometimes we disapprove of what the other person is saying, and so on. What we need to be able to avoid, I think, to make the conversation more fruitful and also to avoid isolating people who have unusual beliefs, is to stop pathologizing the delusion, is stop thinking that because the person is saying something that we find implausible and not supported by the evidence that we have, then the person is not worth talking to, is not worth engaging with. Oh, you need a pill, you don't need a conversation. That's a very common attitude towards people with psychosis. No therapy for people with psychosis, they cannot benefit from it, right? First, you need to medicate them. I'm not saying we shouldn't provide medication when it's helpful. What I'm saying is that we should avoid this pathologization of people with delusions. That is actually going to be a very important phenomenon, because now we see that from the clinical context is being also applied to the non-clinical context. We also hear people talk about people with conspiracy beliefs as ill, out of their mind, not worth talking to. Very often we read in newspapers, someone says, oh, their attitude towards climate change is delusional. They shouldn't have a seat at the table. I'm not going to engage with what they're saying, right? So out of the picture, out of the conversation. So what I'm trying to say is that if delusions can tell us something, they can tell us something about our mutual interactions. And sometimes being curious, being open-minded, asking the question, why would you say so, is more productive than just thinking that the person has nothing to contribute to the conversation. Thank you very much.
Do come and sit down. Some shuffling of microphones and demolition of the stage. Yes, do get your wine. Very important. That's for your other hand. Thank you so much, Lisa. Fascinating talk, and I've got lots of notes and ideas, of which many may be delusional. There were some good chuckles of recognition of some of the delusional beliefs in our audience there, which are not so many chuckles of recognition about looking warmly at your husband, I noticed. Adrian is going to speed round like a gazelle and take a few questions and contributions. So if you have any questions, do think about them. Start to raise your hand. I think one from me is I was very struck by the focus on the emotional need underlying the delusional belief, and it seemed to me that if we're functioning fairly well, we look for true rational approaches or genuine features of the environment that can satisfy our emotional needs. Reason being the slave of the passions, as Hume put it. And if you're delusional, I don't know if this is a causal account or a definitional idea, but to what extent is it that the emotions are just fully driving the belief, and there's that process of trying to match them with reality breaks down because the emotional need is so powerful? Does that come up as an idea?
I think that's a very good point. So, the first observation to make is that traditionally, both philosophers and psychologists thought that the cognitive and the affective spheres were very separate, very independent of one another, right? So, when it comes to beliefs, we should think about evidence in a kind of cool way, not hot way, not determined or influenced by our emotions or our desires. But we have all realized very quickly that you cannot be a good agent, a good decision maker, if you don't have the important information that your emotions provide. And emotions are a big part of how we come to our beliefs and our explanations of reality. So I think you're right. I think it's important to underline what is in common between the person we call delusional and how we see ourselves operating. For instance, what is in common is we all have those emotional needs. We all need explanations when we are faced with a crisis or something that is difficult for us to accept. Now, how we go about finding those explanations may be different, but I think we will find more areas of overlap than we think. So, for instance, a developmental psychologist, Alison Gopnik, she says that we love causal explanations. We love to find, what causes what, right? She says our desire for causal explanations is almost orgasmic. It drives everything we do. It drives everything that children do, right? And that's why we love science so much, because, it gives us explanations of things. When there are new things that happen to us, we are immediately drawn to finding explanations. So I think that is in common between all of us. We need those explanations. But as many have observed, it's not easy to track actual causal relationships between events, because we can see an event happening before another event, but we cannot see the causal connection between them. We need to infer it, right? And we sometimes get it right, and sometimes we get it wrong. So it could be that in a delusional case, I think many cases of things that we call delusion work that way. People identify causal connections between things that are not related. But the desire for finding the causal connection is something we all have, and the mistakes is also something that we all make. Is that in the case of delusion, I guess the mistake is more obvious, because it flies in, it kind of contradicts some of the things that we already believe, to a point where we think, oh, this is difficult to believe, this is implausible, I'm not buying this, there must be a better explanation.
Okay, thank you. I think we have a question at the front from you, Barbara. Is the microphone on? I think I put it on. Should be working.
Legends, are they delusional? Because in a way, legends could be, if you like, something which as a protective idea at the beginning, but those legends echo through history and can be much later harmful. I'll give you an example. Attila the Hun had a son called Choba, apparently, and the second time he attacked Rome, of course, there was a big defeat for his army, and Choba's army was destroyed also. And the legend is that he goes up to the Milky Way, and the Milky Way is made up of his whole army. So this is, in a way, a protective idea for the people who survived, that, there was some grand fate for the people who were in Choba's entourage. But throughout history, there is an echo right down to the present day of maybe that the group whose legend this was is still carries a special role or a special ideal and a special role in history. And this can be harmful, actually. Do you think this is right? Am I thinking?
Yeah, it's
right?
such a good question. Thank you very much. Yeah, and it's a brilliant question. Yeah, I think legends are a very good example of a situation where people are looking for ways of giving meaning to their experiences. And, I didn't really talk very much about the kind of psychological needs that we have, but a big one is the need to feel special and unique. And it's a need that psychologists have identified with people who are attracted to conspiracy theories, but also it's something that we can observe in people with clinical delusions as well. Very often, one kind of implied thing in the delusion is that the person has a special role, as a role that is different from the role of everybody else. Either God has given me this mission or everybody is against me. So the me is always very important in this kind of mini legends that people have. I guess the main difference with the legend is that very often people know that the legend is not representing a kind of shared reality. It's there to give meaning. And I think maybe some religious beliefs may have that function as well. They give us a sense of purpose, a sense of being special, a sense of our life being meaningful, but we don't necessarily use them to understand our physical reality. I guess in the case of some delusional beliefs that we end up objecting to, they're used in the meaning sense, but they're also used as maps to guide us through reality. And that's where the problems emerge, because they're maps for us, but other people do not recognize them as maps. So there is this tension. So I think potentially legends can be, truly believed, I think, and in some cases there will be, but in some cases they're just considered to be, something that is helpful to think about or is comforting to think about without actually being used as ways to guide us through reality. So I think there is an overlap, but it's possible also that delusions go farther than legends in becoming the whole picture and the picture of how things work.
Thank you. Adrian, we have two sitting conveniently next to each other. So, yeah, if you could all please organise yourselves like that. Second row from the back. Perhaps we'll take both together, one after the other, and then you can respond, Lisa.
Okay. My question is, what is the difference between a person who believes in conspiracy theory and are they delusional or what? I'm not entirely sure the difference between the two, the delusion or conspiracy theory. So I just need a bit of an explanation for those two.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it wasn't a yes/no answer, was it? But we'll give you another run at that one. And the question next to you. Thank you.
Can delusions ever be positive in creative arts or even sciences?
Good, very good. Yeah. So, brilliant question. So let's start with the relationship between conspiracy beliefs and delusions. So I think there is an area of overlap. The area of overlap is that if it's not our delusion or our conspiracy theory, we tend to disapprove of them because we find them implausible and unshakable. I also think that, I should report that psychologists have found a lot of similarities in the ways in which people arrive to those beliefs. So of course, in the case of some delusion, we have these very unusual experiences. That's not something that happens to people with conspiracy theories. However, certain thinking styles and aspects of the personality, for instance, may predict how vulnerable someone is to delusions or conspiracy beliefs. So for instance, people with a lot of imagination, people who are prone to magical thinking and superstition, people who have a very low tolerance to uncertainty are both more likely to be attracted to conspiracy beliefs and more likely to be attracted to delusion. So there is like a similarity there, although they are different phenomena. I was also suggesting that a lot of researchers have found similarities between paranoia and persecutory delusions and conspiracy theories. Because if you think about it, the conspiracy theories almost always works like that, right? There is a problem or a crisis or a big event. They want us to believe that, this is causing it, but actually there is a plot against us, right? That, the truth is somewhere else. Now, if you notice, like in the case of the conspiracy theory, it's usually a generalized us, they're deceiving us. They're deceiving, let's say, the general public. In the case of paranoia, it's usually they're deceiving me or they're trying to harm me. But the kind of general feeling is similar. It's motivated by suspicion and distrust. So those are similar. So they're not the same phenomenon, but there are similarities, I think, between them. That's my take. Of course, delusions have been noted to be beneficial in some cases. So you might have heard this myth of the kind of delusional or depressive artist, right? Where most people who are, that's the myth, of course, but brilliant or excel at arts or science are actually very mentally unstable and are characterized by episodes of either psychosis or depression. This has been empirically investigated, and there is no support for this myth. That's why I've called it a myth, because the idea is that, yes, it may happen, of course, that someone absolutely brilliant has problems with their mental health, but usually what you've got is that anything that affects your productivity is going to interfere with your project. So it's not any form of mental illness for anybody that is going to be beneficial. And so some people are warning against romanticizing somehow mental illness, saying, it's kind of this picture of the genius as someone who is different from everybody else, also in this way, in having kind of an unusual experiences and unusual beliefs. There is a sense in which, though, sometimes the delusion really makes you feel good about certain things and can give you extra motivation to do well. So there have been some case studies in the literature, one by my current PhD student, Rosalie Tonano, where someone who has a typical delusion, the kind of thing that can get you sectioned for, actually is very happy about their delusion, is a very functional person, was a good father, can keep a down job, finds the delusion helpful and comforting. And in those cases, it's always a big dilemma for the clinical team. So what do we do, right? So the delusion seems to have this positive effect, but it's also something a bit difficult for us to understand, and we don't know whether in the future it might interfere with functioning. Should we give this person medication? Should I let them be? They're always kind of really difficult cases. They're not the typical case, but it's definitely possible that the delusion has this kind of positive aspect, as you were defining it, for the person's for the person's experience. In this case, was a delusion of persecution, of someone who feels that they're always followed around and observed by everybody. And in this quote in the case study, says, I feel so powerful. I never feel alone. If this had to stop, I would feel terrible. I would feel like everybody else. Right? And in this particular case, the delusion didn't seem to affect him negatively. So I think we have to keep our, minds open to the possibility, that some delusions may not necessarily be harmful or something to fight.
I was listening to, I think, something on the radio about athletes' rituals the other day, where it can be incredibly important to a top tennis player or whatever to bounce the ball exactly 9 times before their first serve. And is that a sort of harmless mini delusion, or do you think it's wrong to characterize it that way?
Yeah, I think we go back to the question about legends. It may be that we are doing it because it makes us feel better, realizing that it doesn't really have a causal effect on our performance. Or we may think that actually, yes, it is a big deal. It will determine whether I'm going to do well or not. And in that case, it goes more towards the delusional aspect. But again, it doesn't seem to be a harmful delusion. It doesn't seem something that, if it remains kind of circumscribed to that particular context, it doesn't seem to affect the persons negatively. And I do think that we all have, mini delusions and mini conspiracy theories, right? Maybe they're not so important. Maybe we don't think about them so much, and that's what keeps us sane in the eyes of other people. But I don't know. I know I have. I always use this example. Like I am deeply convinced that upgrades on my iPhone mean that I'll have to change my iPhone very soon, because the upgrade will ruin the functionality of my phone, and they do it on purpose to force me to give up my phone and make me spend more money. It's like it's a mini conspiracy theory. When I say this, my friends laugh. It's like, but it's like we all have these kind of things, right? And maybe they're not so significant in our lives, but I think it's very difficult to go through life without any delusion. I think we are attached to certain beliefs in such a way that we wouldn't consider evidence against them, even if it was available.
Yeah, I'm not sure you're completely wrong about that. We have one hand up here, Adrian, third row. Robin, is that from the computer? Oh, okay, well, you can wait then. And then we have one in the front row, and then we come to Robin if he's good. Yes, if you come right down. Oh, you've got two up there. Okay, can we keep them fairly brief, and then we'll get to the two here as well, and then maybe Robin.
Hi, this is really brief. Is your discussion related to delusion embedded in Western epistemology of what delusion is, and how do we relate that to people who come from other cultures? And I'm thinking in particular of a person. I as an academic tutor, I had an African student who was very distressed and was behaving as if he was schizophrenic. And actually, he was a man who was gay, but in the culture he came from, he believed he was possessed, otherwise he wouldn't be gay. So every time he had expressed his nature, he heard people telling him it was wrong, and he became unable to function, and eventually was sectioned. But actually, from his perspective, he was acting out his belief system. From our perspective, he was delusional. And when I tried to help him, I couldn't relate to the fact that people were telling him he was possessed, because it was ridiculous to me. So is it a Western view of delusion is what I'm trying to ask you.
Yeah.
And is it culturally embedded, and how far should we extend it to other cultures?
Such a good question again. Yeah, I mean, I am basing a lot of what I'm saying on Western epistemology, and most of the literature on delusion that you'll find in psychology and psychiatry is doing the same. That said, there are some really interesting case studies that remind me of your own experience with the African students, that show that our ignorance sometimes of other people's frameworks of beliefs and values can mean that we attribute delusions when there aren't any delusions. So for instance, Sanati added this wonderful case study of a young young African woman who had just given birth, and who had these delusions of persecution, claiming that the nurses in the hospital wanted to harm her and the baby. Then she started doing much better after medication, and they were just about to discharge her. And she started saying to everybody that her partner wanted to abandon her, to leave her. And everybody in the clinical team thought, oh, she's having delusions again, are delusions of jealousy now. And actually, it turned out that she was perfectly right, that her partner had decided to leave her, because in their cultural framework, if a woman was experiencing mental health issues, it was perfectly legitimate, actually encouraged for their partners to abandon them, right? But it's not something that the clinical team knew about, and they just assumed she had this new type of delusion that she hadn't had before. And she felt extremely betrayed because they didn't listen, they didn't bother to verify what she was saying. So I think this is really interesting because it forces us to think very carefully about the importance of background knowledge and listening and asking, why do you think so? Instead of assuming that a belief is delusional just because it appears strange to us, kind of investigate, explore, where does it come from? And if we have this kind of open-mindedness, sometimes it's not enough. We need also the background knowledge, and sometimes we may lack the background knowledge. But I think that's really important. Now, it is possible that in other cultures, people have beliefs that are contrary to the beliefs that are common in their culture, and they are delusions in that kind of context. But you are absolutely right that we tend to use our own assumptions, which come from Western culture, when we judge other people, which is problematic, and maybe one of the reasons why ethnic minorities are found as kind of having delusions or having this type of psychotic symptoms more than other people. So maybe part of the reason.
Did we have one more question at the back, Adrian? Then we'll come forward. No, it's gone. Okay, great. We have one over on your right, Adrian, and then in the front row.
Thank you, Lisa, for that presentation. Extremely interesting. I am continually amazed that Donald Trump can do so many people. Do you think that a better understanding of reason, of humanitarian principles, and perhaps ethics, and perhaps a better capability to assess priorities would be some protection against this kind of influence?
I think that's a really good question. I was worried that there was no question about Donald Trump. Like, what kind of audience is this? Because actually, I mean, I think it is really important to understand why people behave the way they do. Even if it seems almost impossible for us to understand it. So I think there is a very good chance that the people who support Donald Trump are doing it to respond to certain psychological needs that are not satisfied in other ways. I think what is important for us to understand, if that is the case, what we need to do is not so much trying to argue with them, against them about the merits of a specific policy, because that will not work. Because if their support of Trump or their political or ideological beliefs are identity beliefs, and they recognize themselves in those beliefs, and they have, a kind of a social group that they feel they belong to, and so on, they will not give up their beliefs because of our argument about a specific policy or about the evidence that we bring about the harm that Trump did. But, trying to understand why they support Trump, I think that's important. I think it relates to what we talked about earlier. They need to feel special. They need to feel unique in a society that is changing and they don't recognize themselves anymore. And there are ways of satisfying those needs that are much better than having Trump again as president, right? And so what we need to do, as with the insight paradox that I was talking about before, is provide alternatives. So, during COVID, people were saying, why do people deny that COVID exists? Are they scientifically illiterate? Don't they understand? And the thing is, they need an explanation of what is happening that is meaningful and comforting to them, because everything around them is collapsing. They're losing their livelihoods. They're losing the people they love. They've lost their freedom all of a sudden from one day to the next. They need some explanation that makes sense to them. So don't tell them that they are scientifically illiterate, but do better science communication. Give them a story that is evidence-based, but is also understandable, engaging, makes sense, they can relate to. Give them a role to play. Explain to them that there is a little bit they can do to help the situation, even if this doesn't restore completely the sense of control. It starts to satisfy the psychological needs. So I think, understanding, asking the question, where do you come from? Even in this context, where it may be initially a little bit repugnant for us to think about it, but engaging in conversation is still the best way, long term, because antagonizing people, pathologizing them, saying they're stupid, is not going to do any good in the short term or in the long term. You'll create more kind of resistance to your ideas by behaving in that way. And you will not address the origin of the problem, you just address the immediate consequences of it.
Brilliant.
Thank you. Useful advice there for many of us. We have a question of the...
My question's been asked.
Oh, was it another Trump question? Oh, you wait till evening to come along at once. Robin, go on then.
Building on the chat, okay, so I'm actually chat, okay, thanks. I've got to confess I'm a little bit of a psychologist myself, okay, and fascinated with your correlations between, affective disorder as opposed to cognitive, and the type of delusion possibly. Are you saying that there could be a fairly strong correlation between the type of affective disorder, euphoria, depression, anxiety, fear, rage, whatever it is in the affective spectrum, that might correlate with the type of delusion?
Oh, wow, that's a really good question. So I don't want to pretend I have the competence to answer. I can only give you an example from the work that I've done together with my PhD students. In this case, was Magdalena Antrobus. She worked on depression, and what she found, and I think it's really interesting, is that the type of delusions that you find in major depressive episodes would be the type of delusions that are congruent, so they go along with the negative conception that the person has of themselves. So I think the example that she's using in her paper is this man who believes to be a bad father, even when there is no evidence that he's a bad father, right? He's having a good relationship with his kids and so on. But he keeps having these beliefs that go against the evidence, that are beliefs where he's the bad guy or is guilty of something. And you find that in depression, but interestingly, you don't find that in delusions of grandiosity, for instance, or delusions of reference. So that seems to suggest that there is a correlation between, yeah, yeah, absolutely. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think we're finishing right on time. So just before we close, you might be able to catch Lisa for a quick chat in the bar, maybe briefly, depending on your delusional beliefs about trains this evening. But before we close, just to say we've got our next talk on the 21st of May. It's the Tuesday of the last full week of the month. Perfectly straightforward. I don't know why I find it so difficult. 21st of May. We're going a bit metaphysical. We've been quite psychological recently, but we're going to be looking at causation, which came up today, and the nature of time. The topic is going to be changing views of change. We're going to look at the history of leading views, including paradoxes from the ancients through to ideas about change in our time. And that is with John Pemberton. John, I think John was maybe going to be here. Are you here, John? You in the...
John might be online, wasn't he? Yes.
Oh, he's online.
Hi.
Oh, hi, John. Oh, you're here on my table. John. Sorry, John, it's getting very delusional for me. John's an associate at the Centre for Philosophy of Natural and Social Sciences at LSE and an associate at Durham University, as well as a member of the Society for the Philosophy of Time. So we're very excited to hear from you, John. I hope you have the same Tuesday as me in your diary, and we'll look forward to that. So I'd just like to say finally, thank you to my glamorous assistants, Robin and Adrian. Thank you very much to everyone for coming along tonight. Could Elizabeth Morse please go to see Jack at the bar? Yes, you've left something there. You don't have to leave right now.
Before you leave.
Yeah. Well, depending on what he's left at the bar, maybe you do have to leave right now. I don't know. And while Elizabeth does that, can we also say a big thank you to Lisa for a great talk?